Hello, and thank you for tuning in. Today I'm going to talk about the recent outbreaks of the plague and some of the significance of those outbreaks. Now, most people with a basic history are familiar with the disease. A recent resurgence in places such as Madagascar bring up some real concerns, as this new strain of bacteria seems to be quite resilient and can be spread more efficiently. The most well-known pandemics are attributed to transmission by fleas, which fed off small rodents such as mice, squirrels, rats, and then once that host was no longer viable, they infected humans by biting them. This form of disease is commonly known as the bubonic plague. Now, the plague that is spreading in Madagascar is primarily the pneumonic plague, which means it can be transmitted from person to person from bodily fluids. Usually this is resulting from a person sneezing or coughing, helping the bacteria become somewhat airborne. So it's much easier to transmit among populations, especially close-knit populations. Now, to give you a little bit of background on the disease, there are three main types. One I mentioned earlier, the bubonic plague. And the symptoms of this basically are the onset of fever, headache, chills, weakness, and one or more swollen, tender, and painful lymph nodes. And this form, like I mentioned, is typically from the bite of an infected flea. The bacteria basically multiply in the lymph node closest to where the bacteria enters the body. If the patient's not treated with the appropriate antibiotics, the bacteria can spread to other parts of the body. Another form of the disease is called the septicemic plague. And again, the same type of symptoms: fever, chills, extreme weakness, abdominal pain, shock, and possibly bleeding into the skin and other organs. Skin and other tissues can turn black and die, especially on fingers, toes, and the nose. And this type of plague can actually occur as the first symptom of the plague, or it may develop from an untreated bubonic plague case. And similarly, this form of plague results from bites of infected fleas or from handling an infected animal. Now, the last form, the pneumonic plague, is what's spreading a little more rapidly in Madagascar. Similar type of symptoms: fever, headache, weakness, rapidly developing pneumonia with shortness of breath, chest pain, cough, and sometimes bloody or watery mucus. This type of plague can develop from inhaling infectious droplets or may develop from untreated bubonic or septicemic plague after the bacteria spreads to the lungs. The pneumonia may cause respiratory failure and shock. Pneumonic plague is the most serious form of the disease and is the only form of the plague that can be spread from person to person. Now, I did a lot of research on this. A lot of my research came from the Center for Disease Control, or the CDC. I'll provide links to that in my blog at realintelreport.com. But what I did find was very important to note: the disease is very curable. However, early detection is paramount, as the host can die within 12 to 24 hours of infection. Now, to offer a little more insight into the plague, it's important to understand the history. And really, there were three major plague pandemics that were documented in our history books, and they're very important. Claimed a lot of lives from this disease going crazy. Now, the first recorded pandemic was called the Justinian Plague. It was named after the 6th century Byzantine Emperor Justinian I. Now, the Justinian Plague began around 541 AD, was followed by frequent outbreaks over the next 200 years. It eventually killed more than 25 million people, and it affected much of the Mediterranean basin, virtually all of the known world at that time. And the second pandemic, which is widely known as the Black Death, or the Great Plague, originated in China in 1334 and spread along the trade routes to Constantinople and then to Europe, where it claimed about 60% of the entire European population. Entire towns were completely wiped out. It devastated so much of the population that some reports say that there weren't even enough survivors to bury the dead. There were so many killed. Now, despite this vast devastation caused by this pandemic, mass labor shortages due to the high mortality rates actually sped up economic, social, and technical modernizations. It was even considered to be a large factor in the emergence of the Renaissance in the late 14th century. Now, that brings us up to what's the third pandemic, the modern plague. Again, it began in China in the 1860s and spread into Hong Kong by 1894. And with Hong Kong being a major port, over the next 20 years it spread to port cities around the world from rats on steamships. This pandemic actually caused more than 10 million deaths. But it was also during this last pandemic that scientists identified the bacteria and determined that the spread of the disease was from flea bites. And this did help with controlling rat-associated plague in urban areas, but it easily spread to local populations from ground squirrels and small mammals in the Americas, Africa, and Asia into the rural parts of the countries anyway. Now that's just a brief history of the disease. But again, as I mentioned, since it's a bacterial disease, it can be treated with antibiotics very successfully, but you need prompt identification and prompt treatment because it can kill the host very quickly. Other ways that it's being managed and has been managed in the recent past is through insecticides to control the flea population and assist in controlling the plague ultimately. Now, as far as the most recent outbreaks are concerned, the first half of the 20th century saw more outbreaks in India and in Vietnam during the 1960s and 70s, but plague is now most commonly found in sub-Saharan Africa and Madagascar, areas which now account for about 95% of all the reported cases. And that actually brings us to the most current news, where they're seeing more pneumonic plague outbreaks growing at a very high rate in Madagascar. Now, from what we've learned through history, we know basic information about the plague, but it does have a serious impact on populations. The current situation is worsening in Madagascar. It might possibly become something more notable than what the media is offering. I know politics tends to capture the larger audience, and there's no doubt that crooked, corrupt politics claims innocent lives. However, there are remedies for criminals. Unless there's greater awareness, this kind of killer might go unchecked until it's spreading through our neighborhoods. Anyway, that's all for this segment. I hope you found it interesting. I'd love to hear your comments, feedback, and suggestions. You can also find me on both Podbean and Blog Talk Radio. Check out my blog at realintelreport.com, and you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for stopping by.